Israel poised to expand its war in Gaza, aiming for a total reoccupation of the Strip. Are Israelis speaking about conditions in Gaza in a new way? And the battle over the draft bill has not gone away. Plus, we will have the first in a series of interviews from around the Jewish world. It's Unholy. I'm Jonathan Friedland in London.
And I am Ruth Margalit in Tel Aviv. We are two Jews on the news.
We absolutely are. And the news, you slightly think it might give it a rest, given it's August. Your people, listeners, sharp-eared listeners, will notice that Yonit is away this week. She is on a very well-earned vacation. And, you know, there was a time when it was very, very common for journalists to take August off because nothing really happened. It kind of doesn't feel like that way now, Ruth.
It really doesn't. I mean, the news just doesn't stop. And I'm afraid there's a sense that it sort of keeps getting worse. Just when we think that it can't get any worse, it really does. But yeah, we have a lot to discuss, a lot going on.
We really do. No, there's so much going on. I think, by the way, the turning point for me, maybe it's because I was I was an absolutely new journalist then. August the 2nd, 1990 is seared in my brain because that was the invasion, Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. And I remember lots of newsrooms were kind of affronted. They were like, how dare news happen in August? Don't people realize I'm in my holiday home in Provence? You know, this is outrageous. This is a long time ago, different era.
Actually, in Israel,
ever since then.
Yeah, well, in Hebrew, you say, you know, there's a statement that that wars happen in summer. So that, you know, in Israel, that is definitely true. There's this sort of scorching heat and the kind of rising tensions, and then it just sort of starts. So now it hasn't started, but we're in the midst of a kind of ongoing crisis, just doesn't end.
You may have inadvertently hit an ever so slightly sore point, because when I took my vacation this summer, it was on June the 14th. Wasn't that smart? In other words, I think more or less day 2 or 3 of the Iran-Israel 12-day war. I managed to miss all of it on a very long bit of traveling in South America. It was a wonderful trip, but it did mean I missed the big summer war of this year. But of course, it's a war within a war, and that is ongoing. So let's to explain to our listeners, you're based there in Tel Aviv, you are a writer for The New Yorker and The New York Review and all kinds of other places, but you're obviously monitoring the news extremely closely. As you and I speak, it's more or less midday on Thursday, Israel time, and we know the big decision makers are going to gather later today, Thursday, well, to decide what?
So the Security Cabinet is expected to meet and approve a plan to what initially it was called a full occupation, full conquest of the Gaza Strip. Now they say that it is meant to the IDF is supposed to conquer Gaza City. Only Gaza City is how they phrase it. Of course, it houses, 1 million Palestinians. And we are talking about the central area of Gaza where up until now the IDF hasn't gone in exactly for fear of endangering hostages' lives. We know that this is the area where they are being kept. So it's sort of Gaza City and the tent camps around it. And the idea is that the IDF will go in and issue a full evacuation order for the residents to move south. And and not only does it mean sort of conquering land, but presumably it would mean sort of taking control and administering the lives of the 1 million people who live in this central area. This is just, completely unfeasible. I can't imagine how they would do that. Even, putting aside sort of the moral issue and all of that, there you have an exhausted army. And you have an Israeli economy that hasn't recovered from this war in general. And now this would cost the Israeli budget, tens of billions of dollars, in addition to manpower, in addition to all of that. So this is just, it seems a little sort of imaginary. And there is this talk in Israeli circles and Israeli media that perhaps it's just sort of rhetoric and sort of Netanyahu's spin to kind of harden his positions in order to get Hamas to go back to the negotiating table.
Right, to sort of intimidate them into thinking, well, you better do a deal now because they're going to go all in if we don't. And I understand 1 million Palestinians in Gaza would be further displaced by this move. It would be total control. You make a point about the military and their fears of overstretch, that they don't have the person power. There had been reporting, I've been seeing a lot, about military discomfort with this plan from the very top, from the chief of staff, Eyal Zamir, even talk that, look, if he really can't stomach it, he may quit. And he's very, very new as chief of staff, only installed in the last few months. What are you hearing on that in terms of a kind of revolt of the military or a refusal to do it? And then, I mean, this goes down to sort of public level. We always feel we should make the point on the podcast that this is a conscript army. Every family sends their 18-year-old, male or female, into the army, apart from the ultra-Orthodox. We'll come on to that. But every other Jewish Israeli certainly does that, as well as Druze communities and others. If they have been on duty since October 2023, does that military discomfort with doing this not spill over into a kind of public discomfort with doing this? And discomfort may be putting it very mildly, because it means dragging out this war for even longer, people being kept away from their homes and from their businesses.
Yeah. So, from about Eyal Zamir, I know from people close to him and sort of the second circle, because he doesn't talk publicly, so far he hasn't gone sort of publicly against the sort of the political order of the day and against the government. But those close to him say, and there are these constant leaks, that he's very much against this idea of an occupation. And in fact, has sort of opposed even previous sort of the expanded military operation that we had seen earlier this summer, because he doesn't have the manpower to do it. And this he said in his own voice in a government meeting, saying, I just don't have, people are not coming, they're not showing up to reserve service anymore. And you can't blame them. This is their 5th, 6th round. So you are seeing just, the kind of entire units that have been sort of depleted and are showing up in very reduced numbers. And so that, on the kind of military side, there is this sense that, it's sort of unclear how this will get done. There is talk about, will he quit? Will he sort of resign in protest over this, or won't he? There are all these rumors. I'm not sure. But what you do see is that even in Netanyahu's circle, they're sort of worried. You had Yair Netanyahu, Bibi's son, tweeting, saying that he didn't call out Eyal Zamir by name, but he said, the implication was very clearly about him, saying that he was calling for a kind of military coup, going against the government's orders. So there is definitely rising tension between the government and the sort of the military brass. And in terms of top down, you're exactly right. I mean, you hear from reservists all the time that families are overstretched. They don't know what the war goals are anymore. I've written about this, the kind of growing refusenik sentiment. And this is, there is a kind of group that takes a moral stance against the war and saying, the hostages aren't coming back, and also speaking out about Palestinian casualties. But you have a much larger group saying, put all of that aside. They just can't, their homes, their families can't take it. It means they're away from their businesses, away from newborns, from children. And this has been going on. I spoke to people who have been going to reserve service for, 200, 300 days over the past year and a half. This means that most of their time they're away from home, they're in Gaza, and really with no end in sight and no clear goal as to what the expectation are. If the idea is to bring back the hostages, well, now you're going into an area where the hostages are being kept, and you're very likely endangering their lives.
I mean, just on that, because we were talking about public opinion, obviously the polling is saying north of 80% of the public want this war to finish. And here is the Prime Minister apparently on the verge of a plan that will massively expand the war, escalate it rather than shrink it and wind it up. So a wholly at odds with public opinion. In a democracy, this is quite an amazing sort of set of circumstances. The thrust of that public opinion majority for ending it, yes, partly the kind of fatigue that we've been talking about, but also, and you've just touched on it, obviously the hostages, the desperate urge to get what we think are 20 living hostages back. This doesn't, I think, as far as the people who want this war over to get hostages back are concerned, this not only doesn't bring them back, it endangers their lives because it's combat in those central areas of Gaza where it's thought many of them are held. And if there's, bombs falling and missiles firing, they're going to hit anyone who's there, even if those people are Israeli hostages held deep underground. And so that's the danger. We know that lots of hostages have already been killed through this set of circumstances. Israeli attacks on Gaza, I think the estimate is more have been killed that way than have been rescued by the IDF. Just give us a sense of the mood on that particular point this week, because I'm very mindful that since our last episode of the podcast, these videos that dropped, and that they obviously will have had a big impact.
Yeah, that's right. Over the weekend, a few videos showing two hostages, Eviatar David and Rom Braslavsky, looking just severely emaciated. One of them, Eviatar David, you see him with a shovel in the tunnel, being forced by his captors to dig a grave, presumably for himself. Just it's just horrid Hamas propaganda. But in the midst of this propaganda campaign, you see the state in which, they are right now. And health officials in Israel saying that they have, possibly just days to live, that, they can't go on in this state. And this has had a massive swing here, and kind of massive impact on public opinion once these videos came out. And I think what's maddening to think about this sort of, this idea of an occupation now is, even if it's only spin and only sort of, kind of rhetoric, the only reason Netanyahu has felt the need to do this is, of course, because Hamas has leverage now because of Israeli position, the Israeli policy in Gaza, which, Israel kind of insisted on stopping the aid delivery of the, UN system and imposing this 11-week blockade of aid. We see the state that the Palestinians are in. The entire world sees it. And so now Hamas, its job is largely done. It doesn't have to do much more because the entire world sees what's happening in Gaza. And so Hamas feels emboldened, and now Israel has to take this sort of just insane step and announce a full military occupation just in order to get Hamas back to the table and get some sort of deal underway. So really, just the kind of the strategy behind it, let alone, put aside the moral aspects and all of that, is really just mind-boggling.
Yeah. Just two things on this that strike me. One is a contradiction, a circle I can't myself square, something I don't understand, which is Hamas have benefited hugely in propaganda terms from the images of Palestinian civilian suffering and starvation and hunger. We've said often on this podcast, I've said, they don't care about their own people. For them, it's quite useful that when Palestinians die, when Palestinians' children die and are seen by the rest of the world, they believe, as you just said, it gives them this political advantage with international leverage on Israel, international pressure on Israel, rather, as people are angry around the world and even inside Israel, we'll come on to that, about what's happening in Gaza. Do they not think it somehow undermines that sympathy if they then put out a video showing that they are starving people very deliberately, in some ways, directly, much more directly doing it with this individual, and the kind of barbarism of demanding a man dig his own grave. It's so awful. I just thought, if they're playing this game of international opinion, having just got some movement, as it were, on towards their side, they somehow massively undermine it, it seems to me. I'm not asking you to put yourself in the minds of the Hamas
I will say,
propaganda
it's
masters, but it's an odd thing
it is.
From their own point of view.
It is. Although, presumably they can point out the fact that, they tell the hostages in the videos, you see the hostages saying, addressing the Israeli government and the military and saying, you're starving us. So, of course, they're being forced to say this, but the idea being that Israel is not only starving the people of Gaza, but is also starving the Israeli hostages. So you can see Hamas kind of, sort of twisting this around even more, Not only are you doing this to us, to the Palestinians, but you're also doing this to your own people. And then the other thing, which is just completely, all of it, right? We shouldn't take these videos at face value. But what they are is just an urgent call for action. There's just no other way to look at it. One of the hostages, Eviatar David, we had seen him in a video from, I believe it was March, when there was the ceasefire and there was the release of 30 living hostages, and Hamas put out a video of him back then, he is in a car, he's seen in a car looking at this release of the hostages and sort of, holding his head in his hands and pleading to be the next one out. And How can you leave me behind, him and another hostage? He was in a terrible state back then, but he was nowhere near the emaciated state you see him in now. So you really see the difference that only these, 3-4 months have made.
Yeah. I mean, the other half of that conundrum I was going to get onto was this assumption about international pressure, which obviously was, as it were, flowing Hamas's way because it was international pressure on Israel. The assumption last week, in the last 2 weeks, had been that all these moves, we talked about them on the podcast last week, with this slew of countries promising to recognize the state of Palestine, that there was real international pressure on Israel, the likes of Canada, the UK, France, even Donald Trump saying there's real starvation. A lot of people thought, well, even Netanyahu can't defy this and keep holding on against that level of world pressure. Here we see his response a week later. This war all of the rest of the world hates? Guess what? I'm going to expand it. I mean, if we were looking last week for a question, does international pressure, brackets, outside Donald Trump, matter? In a way, Netanyahu's giving us his answer, isn't he? He's sort of saying, go hang. I don't care.
Yeah, he's sort of saying, I care more about Smotrich at this point than I do about the UK, Germany, France, whoever. I care more about my far-right ministers helping me stay in power, as it were, and sort of giving them what they want, which is both occupation of the Gaza Strip, expanded operations, and, a kind of endless war, forever war. And I really don't care about this international condemnation other than to open some, there is a kind of opening of some more aid crossings and, not nearly enough. But still, I suppose, he can point to this, expanded aid delivery. And there are also, the aid food distribution centers are about to be expanded from 4 points to 16 centers. Of course, again, this is nowhere near what had existed before. We had 400 distribution points by UNRWA back, before Israel completely stopped that distribution system and replaced it with the GHF, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation.
Yeah. I mean, this all came after Steve Witkoff did his visit to one of those Gaza Humanitarian Foundation so-called distribution sites. And, naively, I thought maybe he will be so appalled by what he sees that he'll say, look, call the whole thing off, let the UN come in and feed people. And instead, the response is to make 4, which, as you say, was already such a tiny figure, into 16, which is only slightly less tiny figure, considering that hundreds and hundreds of these distribution points are needed. But yeah, it does seem to suggest that pressure hasn't gone anywhere. Slightly sort of nerd point here, but a lot of people did assume that once the Knesset was in recess, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, these far-right ministers, would lose some of their leverage on Netanyahu. He would be freer to placate the likes of Canada and the UK and France and others, and maybe make some moves on humanitarian aid, because with the parliament not in session, the far-right's ability to bring down the government would be, for procedural reasons, reduced. Yet here we are in August, the Knesset is in recess, we've reached that point. Not only is he not moving to end the war, he's moving to expand it. How is it that Smotrich and Ben-Gvir seem to have retained their hold, even though procedurally we were all hoping and had been told that they would weaken?
Right. So I think the first issue is that there are these rumors that Netanyahu promised Smotrich and Ben-Gvir something in return for the expanded aid delivery, right? You saw Israel opening crossings more, allowing these airdrops. Clearly, there was a price for that. And it could be that the price is now being sort of given in the form of this occupation, that this is basically his promise to them, and now he's making good on it. And the other issue is that it could also be that really this is more of a tactic to get Hamas back to the table than it is. Even without Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, he might have done this just in order to have sort of leverage over Hamas and get something in return, because, a ceasefire deal is nowhere in sight at this point. We were very close to having one. It was Israel that breached the last ceasefire deal back in March when, resumed the war. And now it can't get Hamas and it can't get anything in return. And so this could be all kind of a tactic. But even if it is just a tactic, you can see how it very quickly sort of spirals out of control. You have, you could have, Israeli casualties in Gaza. This is very much a mess that Israel is heading towards. And we'll see, we'll see what the cabinet decides. But it's, it's very, very concerning news.
It is. Let's just deal with two news stories. They're both sort of related, or they look similar. They happened, I think, within hours of each other on a single day. Another confirmation that August is very much still a news month. One firing and one attempted firing in Israel. The ousting of the chair of the Defense and Foreign Relations Committee of the Knesset. I think in other countries that would look quite minor, but it really matters in Israel. So just tell us why that committee matters and who the person we're talking about is.
Right. So the person who chairs it is Yuli Edelstein, who comes from Netanyahu's Likud party. In other instances in which people have been removed from their offices, there has always been a kind of pretext as to why this was being done. Here, there is no pretext. We know why he was being removed, and this is because he wanted a bill, or he refused to sign a bill that would enshrine the exemption of the ultra-Orthodox men from military service. And we are in wartime, and the government, proposed this bill in order to placate their ultra-Orthodox partners.
This was one of them. Like I said, there were two firings. This one, Netanyahu got what he wanted. There's someone else he wants out. It's for such direct personal reasons. But here there are more obstacles in the way. I find it really interesting they happen within hours of each other. You'll be able to shed light on why the timing. But just tell us who the other would-be firing of the week was.
Right. The other would-be firing was the Attorney General, Gali Baharav Miara. By all accounts, very serious, independent Attorney General, and has been really doing quite a remarkable job, I would say, especially in wartime, kind of, shepherding and navigating a government that, by all accounts really is kind of out of control in its sort of power grab and in its attempts to kind of weaken the court. And sort of enforce its policy without due process. And Gali Baharav Miara has been very sort of strong, but also I would say fair, not kind of activist, but really sort of just calling for kind of normal procedure. And she was, panel just voted to remove her. The Supreme Court immediately issued an interim order saying that this would be frozen, And by all, in all likelihood, the Supreme Court would vote this, would rule this down, would overrule and not allow her firing. But still, this is remarkable, even if the Supreme Court decides that this is illegal. Right now, what you have is a government that says that the Attorney General can't participate in its committees, which is what she's supposed to do. And there is the Minister of Communications, Shlomo Kari, has already announced that he wants to go ahead and vote for her replacement. And just for our listeners, it sounds sort of, again, it sounds obscure, the Attorney General, and what do we want, during wartime? This is the only hurdle standing in the government's way, the Attorney General and the Supreme Court. That's it. There's nothing here in terms of checks and balances in Israel. These are the only two institutions that exist. And what you have now is a government that wants to fire the Attorney General. And when you have a Supreme Court that says, stop, this is illegal, and apparently that's what they're going to say, you may see ministers who say that this should be overridden and that, that we shouldn't listen to the Supreme Court, which means, in effect, that there is no balance, there is no check over the government, if that were to be the case. And that's extremely alarming.
Now, Ruth, obviously thrilled anyway to have you sitting in the co-host chair for the podcast, but really particularly now because of a piece you wrote just the other day in the New Yorker, the headline, Israelis are starting to talk about famine in Gaza. And it was about the national conversation, the discourse, including in the media inside Israel. And this is a subject you've written on a lot for the magazine. It's just so interesting to me. That appeared, I think, last week in the magazine. And I'm interested to know whether they were starting to talk about it, continued to talk about it. Is it still on the airwaves? Besides the airwaves, just among ordinary people, are people, regular people, in cafes and in their workplaces, are they talking about it?
Okay, so I think the issue is very much on the table. There's just no way to ignore it anymore. And, even though, the Israeli media for a long time hasn't really sort of showed the images coming out of Gaza, Israelis knew what was happening. They try to travel abroad. They're unwelcome anywhere they go. These cover stories of emaciated Palestinian children, they shout at us from magazines and from the sort of the far reaches of the internet. There's just no way to ignore this conversation anymore, even if it's not taking place on our sort of local airwaves. So the conversation started. And then it was interesting because I think even, sort of sympathizers of the government and of Netanyahu and the government policy sort of made a point of saying for the first time, yes, famine exists in Gaza. There is hunger there. Now, there's a distinction in Hebrew between hunger, ra'av, and har'ava, which is starvation. And the point being, yes, they're hungry, but are they starving? Is this a forced policy? And of course, when you see what we had just discussed earlier, when Israel replaces, 400 distribution points for aid with just 4, even if you have the best intentions in the world, this is going to, in effect, create chaos and hunger and sort of these terrible sights of children going hungry and crying out for food and, families who can't feed their children. So the conversation started, and then I think it took a turn with the hostage videos, with the release of the hostage videos, and sort of people who started sort of saying that maybe this is wrong, maybe this is immoral, sort of took a pause and said, well, I've seen a few of those, the sort of sentiment being, you want to see hungry people, look at our hostages in Gaza, which is a fair point. But of course, both things can coexist, right? We have hostages who are being tormented and starved, and we have Palestinians who need to be fed and they need all of it, right? Medical services, food, just everything that is lacking in Gaza. And so the conversation started, it took a turn, and now it's unclear, it's sort of unclear whether there was a poll out saying that 47% of Israelis still think that there is no hunger in Gaza and it's all just Hamas lies, Hamas propaganda. You have 18%, so this is sort of a minority saying maybe there is hunger, but I don't care. That was really the phrase that they used. And you have a quarter of Israelis, 23%, who say, yes, there is hunger in Gaza and I care. Now, it might not sound like a lot, but I actually think that it's not a negligible, it's not just like 3% of Israelis who are talking about this. 23% is something to sort of start with, at least, start the conversation.
I mean, your point about that brief window that opened and then it was closed by the release of the hostage videos, that what sympathy some people were beginning to feel. It goes again to what we were talking about earlier about Hamas in a way, just purely in terms of the propaganda war.
It worked.
Did sort of tread on their own story there because they had this moment of sympathy, not for Hamas,
I see
for
what you
the
mean.
people of Gaza, which they then closed shut. And I think it goes to this point again, they don't actually care about ending the hunger, because if they did, they would know that would have reduced the likelihood of action from the Israeli side. The other point, I mean, Matti Friedman, who's actually sat in your chair a couple of times and is a close observer again of media coverage, particularly internationally, writes for the Free Press. He wrote a very interesting piece about how don't interpret, I think it's fair to summarize his piece as saying, don't interpret some of that apparent Israeli public indifference to Gaza wholly to being uncaring.
Right.
Some of it is a kind of skepticism born of years now of claims made about events in Gaza that then turn out to be propaganda and false. And I think he mentioned the incident that happened very early on in the war, the Al-Ahli hospital, where it was claimed Israel had done it. The news had gone around the world. They were talking about 500 killed. And it turned out to have been a sort of misfired missile from Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and the death toll was much lower. Israel hadn't done it, and many few people died. And so he said that's left in many Israelis, a feeling of you can't believe any of it. It's all propaganda, no matter who says it, which NGO, which news agency, Reuters, BBC, the World Health Organization. They all are dupes of Hamas. And therefore, we can put our fingers in our ears and not listen to any of it. Do you buy that yourself?
I think that's absolutely true, that this is sort of the way many Israelis see it. And in my piece, I spoke to Oren Persico, who's a great journalist for the media publication, The Seventh Eye. And what they do is sort of media monitoring. And the way he phrased it is, he says that in Israel, there's a kind of campaign for the margins. And so you take these, the sort of the marginal cases of, let's say, there have been these instances of children who are, on the cover of these magazines and newspapers who are then, they're sort of presented as starving. And then you find out that they have these underlying health conditions and that maybe that's why they look the way they look. The New York Times famously had to issue a kind of clarification on the matter, and other news organizations too, which is a fair point, right? I mean, this shouldn't happen. We should get the full context. But I also see, Persico's point was that, the fact that you have a few, sick children who might have underlying conditions, which makes them look the way they look, doesn't mean that, that there aren't starving children in Gaza, and that also these sick children deserve to live and not starve, right? So you take these sort of fringe cases and you present it as if, there's no hunger in Gaza. That's a huge stretch, but it is the way that this is sort of perceived in much of Israel, is that it's all propaganda. Some of it's sort of blatant propaganda by Hamas, AI revisions and manufacturing and staging and all of that. And some of it maybe not blatant propaganda, but a kind of Western world, woke media that sort of, wants to see a certain narrative and sort of puts, kind of slams these images to sort of fit its narrative. So yes, it's not that Israelis don't see or don't care. They think this is somehow being manipulated, and that what the world sees is not what they see, and is really what they see is the right way of sort of seeing this.
Yes. I mean, on that specific case of the emaciated child, I think you spoke about that very well. I think the point that groups who monitor hunger make is that it is always the children who are vulnerable already with pre-existing conditions, or adults too, actually, who are the first to suffer if there's a shortage of food.
That's right.
So the fact that they are in that condition doesn't in any way mitigate the case. On the contrary, it alerts you to it. It tells you that there's this problem. And of course, it's no defense to say this child looks that way because we denied him vital medicine, not because we denied him food. That doesn't really wash as an argument. So the child's underlying health condition, I don't think, limits the case. It actually in some ways reinforces it. So I agree with you very much on that. Just in terms of the particular discussion there's been around media, I know that people, on some of the mainstream channels, Channel 12 and others, the argument there is that, okay, they are showing more now, but it's not like they showed nothing before. They make the point, I think, that they did show what was going on. It's just as time has passed, they're now showing more of it. That cannot be said of Channel 14. And Channel 14 is a phenomenon that, again, I'm not sure how much people are really aware of it outside the country. You have written about it a lot. You profiled one of their big star anchors. I think on here, on this podcast, I've often referred to it as the kind of Fox News of Israel. Just give people a sort of sense of how they are talking about all of this, whether they are admitting even a part of it, whether are they talking about hunger but not starvation? Are they not, or are they saying it's all lies?
So first, just on Channel 14 itself, I agree. When I went into writing about the channel, I also kind of made the comparison to Fox News. And then the more I reported, the more I realized someone made the point to me that it's really more like a kind of Russia Today, sort of outlet, or, a kind of Russian sort of state arm of the government, because really what it is a Netanyahu-friendly media outlet. They would never, it's a network that's completely geared to Netanyahu's sentiments and sort of changing, evolving opinions. And so it kind of also makes for a sort of contradictory sort of journalistic line, because often, they would say one thing and then Netanyahu changes his mind or his policy, and suddenly you see, for example, this the lead star you talked about, ינון Magal. So when Netanyahu was all sort of about kind of total victory, he had the hat going and all of that, wore it on air. As soon as there was the ceasefire agreement over the winter, ינון Magal wore a hostage pin for the first time on air. He sort of does these twists and turns according to what the government is sort of the kind of the agenda of the day is. But on Gaza, it's been fascinating to see the coverage there, because actually they haven't ignored the hunger there, but they show pictures. First of all, they show, kind of markets full of food in Gaza. That's one thing, just, kind of food constantly going into Gaza as if to say, there is no hunger. There is, all of it is, I think they don't say where this footage is coming from. They often show starving children, and they do this horrible thing of showing their relatives and saying, look, and kind of poking fun at the sort of the healthy looking fat. They say, look at the mother, she's chubby, and look at this, this girl who's supposedly starving. Yes. They do this sort of twisted narrative of trying to point out Hamas propaganda, but actually just making it completely awful. On sort of, if you're looking at it from the outside, it just looks as if Israel is just really kind of lost it on this issue. And and also calling out now, they call out mainstream media for starting to cover the issue and for starting to speak about it. They say that, mainstream Israeli media is now sort of kind of has taken the Hamas propaganda line and sort of ran with it.
And they had a go, didn't they, at Channel 12 for doing a sort of 10-minute item where it said hunger in Gaza across the scene. And indeed, and you wrote about this, indeed about Yonit herself, a comment on the...
That's right. She made a comment on air, and they just went, for 10 minutes, they just went off on her. And on Channel 12, it got very personal, Yeah,
and she said it wasn't a PR problem, it was a moral problem and should be looked at like that, or certainly suggested that. So there's been, but your point about Russia Today, absolutely taken. Is it a last thing, and this can be quite brief, I mean, is it sort of a niche thing, this audience, or is it now a very big part of the media?
It started out as rather niche, and now it got to be, some evenings it's the second highest watched news edition in Israel. I think, someone made the point that it's about, you should think of it as sort of 30% of Israelis, that's what they watch. A third of Israelis, that's what they consume. And that's, that's not a small number.
It's a really, really big number. Before we completely leave all of this, I just want to ask you about something that really hit me quite hard just because of my huge personal admiration for him. And that is David Grossman, the novelist, writer, I think widely, universally perhaps regarded as Israel's finest living writer, prize-winning novelist all over the world, and somebody who has acted as a kind of moral conscience of the country. Gave an interview with an Italian newspaper, I think last week, saying that he now, with a broken heart, has to use the word genocide about what Israel is doing, that his government is acting genocidally. There are very few people, I think, who think more deeply about the Shoah, very few Israelis who think more deeply about the Shoah than David Grossman. And I think there are very few people in the world who think more deeply about language than David Grossman. So it is a huge deal that he's saying this. I mentioned how you see it, and again, what impact it's having where you are.
It has quite a bit of impact here in Israel, and this was reported. The coverage said, David Grossman calls this a genocide. But the larger context is exactly the way you framed it, which, what the sort of the answer that precedes it, which is, full of sort of fellow feeling and torment. And he's saying, with a broken heart, and this is impossible to ignore anymore. And I can't believe that, the Jewish, we are the Jewish people, and we have to talk about this, and we are, doing this. And I just looked at it really, I had sort of tears in my eyes just reading his interview there, because you can see a man who's tormented, who doesn't want to be saying what he's saying, but also wants to speak sort of, to be precise and to be specific and to call out what is being done. And, I agree with you. There are few people who are as sort of, clear thinkers in Israel. And I sort of read it and felt along with him what it is to be thinking that about the place, it's an impossible thing. And it's one I keep thinking about too, raising children here and how do we go on and what do we tell ourselves and how do we make it better? This is the sort of, these are the thoughts that we keep having, that many of us keep having here. And we have to make sense of this place in order to keep living here. And to go back to just, because it does go back to the hostage issue you, and also Channel 14. There's been this narrative in Israel that, someone on Channel 14, and this is very much the government's line, that, it's a personal tragedy, is what they said about the hostages. Yes, it's terrible, but it's a personal, it's a personal tragedy, individual stories. And really, we should remember that what keeps, Israel is a difficult place to live in. It requires a lot from someone: mandatory service, military service, high cost of living, terrible security, terrible, tough neighborhood. And the only thing we have going for us, and this is sort of speaking from experience as someone who moved back to Israel to live in Israel, the only thing we have going is this sense of solidarity and the sense that we have these deep ties that bind us together. And if we look at hostages, civilians who have been kidnapped and held in Gaza, as, a kind of personal story, a family that, sort of has bad luck, then really this place has no justification anymore. And from my view, and David Grossman is exactly right, what we're doing in Gaza, what is happening to Israeli society, this can't go on. I think we're sort of seeing the emergence here of a kind of clear distinction between a humanist camp and an anti-humanist camp. And maybe that's a hopeful note to sort of end this kind of segment on, because I think the humanist camp has to win out in the end. Sort of a camp that all it says is that it sanctifies human life, that there is value in human life, regardless if it's a hostage, it's a Jew, it's a Palestinian child living in Gaza. This is what it boils down to. And you have a camp that says, it sanctifies something else, something, land, religious redemption, a kind of messianic vision, Jewish supremacy, I don't know what, but it isn't human life. And Grossman speaks to that.
He does, and when he does speak, people do listen. I listened as he spoke, really, with a broken heart, describing. We are, this summer, doing our little world tour. That isn't a series of live events all over the globe, unfortunately, just yet, although we did make a little start in June in London. But instead, Yonit and I have been speaking with people from Jewish communities around the world, including those that don't always make the sort of front page news-wise. We begin with a conversation from somewhere that we are hugely interested in. Yonit and I spoke with somebody very well placed to tell us about the life of Jews in Germany. Ilanit Spinner has been working as a journalist, news reporter and foreign correspondent for the German broadcaster ARD, among others, since 2008, and she is a fixture of the German Jewish community, often moderating key communal events. We are so glad to have you, Ilanit. I have to begin by asking first about your name, because it sounds to my ear like an Israeli first name, Ilanit, but I don't think that's the case. But you tell us.
It is the case. Thanks for having me, first of all. And yes, it is an Israeli name, Ilanit. And it's been, my parents obviously didn't know I was going to end up being a journalist, because I've been, all over the world reporting from places that, you don't even know how to spell them. And I get calls from the studio, people asking me, I don't care where you are, but how do you pronounce your name? And I've had everything. You cannot imagine. So yes, it is an Israeli name. And I do have two names, I have to say that. But I always chose the first one. I mean, Ilanit Joy, which would have been much shorter, much easier for everyone to pronounce. But I love the name.
You're not yourself Israeli.
My dad was actually born in Israel, in Jerusalem, post World War II, and as many of that generation. But actually, my grandparents went back to Germany. So he was born in Jerusalem. He lived there for, I think, 3 to 4 years. He was there in kindergarten, but they left when he was around 4 or 5, and they went back to Germany, back to Munich. So he's very German. I do have to say that at that point. It's very, very German, not Israeli, but yeah. So I do have double citizenship. I do have an Israeli and German passport.
That's a lot of interesting biography just in that story, I have to say. Family coming to Israel, going back to Germany. I think what we kind of want to talk about just right off the bat is to get your sense of the lie of the land. Like, tell us about the Jewish German community, obviously with all of the troubled history there. What does the community look like today? How many Jews are there? Where are they, situated in general? Just a little bit of that generally to get us started.
So There are about 225,000 Jews in Germany, and I would say about in between 95,000 and 100,000 are member of a Jewish community. Now, there has been lots of Jewish people coming from the former Soviet Union in the 90s. So that's why we have rather large Jewish communities at this point in Germany. But what we've seen, and that's a bit problem that the small communities face, that many leave for bigger cities. So we have a very vivid Jewish life in, big cities like Munich, which is where I'm from, Berlin, Frankfurt, obviously, Hamburg. But the smaller towns, they're struggling because people leave and tend to go to the bigger cities. And most of the Jews in Germany are secular Jews. So many are not member of the community. They do keep some traditions, some don't keep anything. So it's there's a very, I would say, different picture from Jews in Germany than the one that is being portrayed in the media, where we see Jews with a kippah, and that's what the general German people think, that Jews wear kippah, they all keep the traditions, they're not secular, but that's not the case. So the majority is secular. There's a vivid, lively Jewish community, and we've seen that there's a change, because obviously from many of the people coming from the former Soviet Union, you have lots of like, if there are any events, everything's in Russian as well, to integrate them. And so there's been a change. Let's put it this way, there's a difference between the Jewish communities in, let's say, the 1980s up to about 1995, 96, and then the way we see the communities since then. They brought a lot to the German life for Jews, and we're thriving and we're growing, and that's thanks to the immigrants from the former Soviet Union.
I remember when even visiting Germany in the 1980s and meeting the Jewish community, it was seen already as a sort of an object of curiosity and wonder, that how come there are Jews in Germany, as if their very existence was a sort of paradox, because the assumption was that either Jews of Germany were killed, or any who had remained would want to get the hell out of such a place given the Holocaust. I'm interested to know whether now, 4 decades on, whether that kind of sense of paradox and against the odds informs Jewish life every day, that it's just there in the atmosphere, or whether in a way that's just the sort of thing that people from outside would see, but for Jews in Germany, it's just another place for Jews to live.
It's difficult but I'm sure we're going to get to this, life has changed for Jews in Germany since October 7th. So I do want to have to specify this there, but I'm not going to get into that. But obviously things have changed. You think much more about being Jewish now than you have done, 2 years ago. But as a matter of fact, and I can just talk for myself here, the first time that I actually thought about that was actually being abroad. I was in New York doing an internship when I was 16 years old. And I met 2 Jewish American girls, and I said, I'm from Germany. And then they looked at me like completely blank, and they said, but you're Jewish. And I said, yes. And they said, but that's not possible. And I didn't know, where is this going? Like, what do you mean this is not possible? And they said, you can't be Jewish and live in Germany and be German. That's just not possible. And I said, well, it certainly is, because I am. Many of my friends they couldn't believe it. It was something that they could not believe. So that was the first time that I really thought about this. But living in Germany is something you don't think about. Of course, past is a big thing. And it's something that, when you talk to German people, and I host lots of events, and I say, what are the first things that come in mind if you think about Judaism? And the only 2 things that everyone, whether they're politicians, the everyday guy who works, everyone says anti-Semitism and Holocaust. That's the only 2 things they mention. And of course, talking about the past and the Holocaust is a very important thing, especially if you look at education schools. It's what they mainly teach young people still today. So of course, it's part of being Jewish. But living in Germany is something that I don't think about this. It's not something that is part of my personal Jewish life in Germany.
You do say that things, and I assume they really have, and we see this only from the outside, but have really changed after October 7th. Could you talk a little bit about how that changed Jewish life?
It's horrible. It's a disaster. I can't put it any other way. And I'm not going to get into numbers. We know there's a rise of anti-Semitism by 70% since October 7th. It's something that's not only been happening in Germany. We've seen it all across Europe. I don't have to tell you the situation in Spain is horrible, in the UK. So it's not something that only people in Germany, Jews in Germany, are faced with, but it's something that you think about on an everyday basis. So let's start with really small things like Uber. I have everything, everything's online. They have all my details. They know where I live. Obviously, I put down my real name, Ilanit. Jonathan, you asked me at the beginning, is it a Hebrew name? So as a matter of fact, most of the Uber drivers have some Arab background. Many are Palestinians. And so I got into discussions and arguments and things that you do not want to get into because he knows where I live. I live by myself. And I had a situation where I was in the car and he goes, where's your name from? And I said, I don't know. And he says, is it an Israeli name? And I said, no, it isn't. And he said, yeah, I think it is. And he started calling someone speaking in Arabic. And I really felt really uncomfortable in that situation. So I stopped using my first name on all my public things, whether it's Uber or any taxi app. I use Joy as my first name. I have a mezuzah at my door. So whoever delivers something to me, whether that might be Amazon, whether that might be food, they see the mezuzah, they see that I live there. It's become a real big issue. I was actually, I'm moving to Berlin. So I was looking for a flat last week. And a very nice guy showed me the apartment and he said, oh, Ilanit, I've never heard that name before. Where is it from? And I said, it's an Israeli name. And he says, do you have, and I felt horrible. And it was the first time ever in my life that I did not say, yeah, I have a Hebrew name. My dad was born in Israel. I'm Jewish. I didn't say it. I did not say it. And so, yeah, reality has changed. I have people in Berlin who have Stars of David written on their doors right after October 7th. And and that was the worst part of all for me. We've had lots of Israelis after October 7th, not knowing how is the situation going to turn out, what is going to happen, who moved to Germany with their families, with their children. Many have friends and family in Germany because they thought here we're going to be safe, not knowing what is going to happen in our country after October 7th. And then they were told by the Jewish communities, don't speak Hebrew, don't show your Star of David, just make sure no one knows you're Israeli. So I had people that I spoke to who said, I don't know whether to be more scared in Israel where we're in war or in Germany being Jewish talking Hebrew. And I felt so ashamed. I just couldn't believe it. But that is the reality that Jews and I'm not going to say only Germany, Jews in Europe live at the moment.
It's very sobering hearing you speak, and I feel for you those experiences you've mentioned. But it's also unexpected in the sense that what a lot of people take away from what they see of Germany is the statements from the political and the governing classes. And there, Germany has been a bit of an outlier. It has continued to support Israel, even when other countries in Europe have been moving away for obvious historical reasons. So, for example, even there's this ongoing business about recognition of the state of Palestine. France is doing it, the UK seems set on doing it, and Germany is not doing it. And we know of cases, of prizes that are not awarded to artists because they have said something critical of Israel, and therefore the judging panel decides that's uncomfortably close to anti-Semitism and prizes are withheld. In other words, there was an impression that Germany was the one place, as it were, where actually you would be freer of some of these pressures than elsewhere in Europe. And it became a sort of, a great paradox that, the best place to be Jewish or even Israeli right now outside Israel would be Germany. What you're saying is that, yeah, maybe politicians are saying that at the top, but day-to-day life is not that way.
Absolutely not. And I see what you mean. And yes, we have the reason of state, the so-called reason of state, which Merkel mentioned years ago, and it's still up to date.
Explain that idea.
Yes. So that's the next thing. It's a very vague idea. Because what does that mean? I mean, that is the big question that, especially in those past months, has been asked by the people. No one really knows what does that mean. So the security of Israel, the existence of Israel, is a reason of state for Germany. But does that mean Germany is going to send soldiers to Israel if it's really necessary? I mean, I don't know. I'm not Meretz, but I'm going to say no, they probably won't. So it's a very vague concept. It sounds great. But the question is, and that's what politicians, historians actually are asking, what exactly does that term even mean? No one knows. It sounded great, but no one really knows what it means. And yes, you are right. From what we see now, Germany still sides to Israel, and it's the feeling you get from most, not all, I do have to say. If you look at many of the parties, the Greens, the left, so it's not everyone in Germany and all the politicians, but many politicians. But that is not what the Jewish people feel in terms of my neighbor, my friend. And that's something that you see. I have Jewish and non-Jewish friends, and what many people in the Jewish community have told me, we feel so left alone by our non-Jewish neighbors. And if you have, I mean, we saw the protests after October 7th, and we had them in Berlin, we had them in Munich, of Palestinians and Arabic people going on the streets, selling sweets, celebrating what happened on October 7th on German streets. So that is part of the reality. And if you have pro-Israel demonstrations, and I'm not even talking about now, I mean, we see with everything that's happening that, things have changed, in the past, especially months. But even at the beginning, the questions were, where are all the, and I'm talking about, the neighbor, the teacher, I'm not talking about politicians, but where is everyone? No one. And I'm saying no one because the numbers were, I don't even remember how many people, but there were a couple of hundred people, mainly from Jewish communities, who went out on the streets, demonstrating against what happened on October 7th. But you would expect, if something like this happens, that thousands would take the streets and say, we were talking about the worst crime since the Holocaust that happened to Jews. You would expect hundreds of thousands to go on the street, especially in Germany, saying, this is something that we do not accept. This is something that, especially with the rise of anti-Semitism, we do not want in our country. And there were a couple of hundred people going out on the streets. So that shows that the general support from the people and what the politicians say are two completely different things. And you do feel left alone. And I spoke to friends about this because they said, non-Jewish friends calling me saying, but come on, is it really like a thing? Do you notice a difference since October 7th as a Jew? And I said, oh my God, yes. And I told them what I just told you. And they couldn't believe it. They're like, no way. But so it's something that unless you feel it, unless you know what it means, I think many people cannot really relate. And I do have to say that, especially even my close friends, none of them went out on the street. None of them said something. So it's something that you live in your comfort zone, and it's easier not to say anything, not to put yourself out there. So I can say that for many people, many Jews in Germany, saying that they feel very, very left alone.
I can't say I'm glad we're having this conversation. The content is very, some of it is hard to digest. So I think it's really important for our listeners to hear this about the community and what it needs. But I'm thinking of you personally. It's not only the issue of the Israeli name. You're a journalist. You're a prominent journalist. You're out there talking to the politicians, talking to people. Is that, and of course the network covers, everything that's going on here. Is that an issue as well? Does that add another layer of sort of complexity to being Jewish in Germany today?
Of course, it makes it even harder, but I do try because otherwise I could not do my job. I try to differentiate and see my personal life as a Jew in Germany and what it means. And, thinking it's something that I speak to my parents about. They say, I don't think there's a future. They live in Spain, which is not better.
Wow.
So they tell me, like, where do we go? And that's something that people talk about right now. Jews talk about, where do we go? Is Israel our only option we have, where to go. So that's on the personal level. And on a professional level, it's hard because as the ARD, the news station I work for, which is the Bavarian Broadcasting, we are responsible for the reporting coming out of Israel and Gaza. And it has been very, very hard. And I've seen colleagues of mine, not necessarily working in Israel, but working in other studios we cover Iran, we cover Turkey, we cover Italy. So we cover many important countries. And I have producers working there who post things on social media saying genocide and, the worst things. I'm not even going to get into details about Israel and what they're doing and how can they be stopped. And I'm not even going to mention all eyes on Rafah and everything. So it's hard because I can't, what do you do? Do you answer every single person? Do you put yourself out there? Because, I still see my professional life as a reporter. I'm trying to make a difference and to change if people do bad reporting, if things, especially now that what we've seen with all the pictures from children, starvation, and then you have the New York Times, you have Italian newspapers who put pictures out there. I don't have to tell you of starving children, and now it turns out no, they're not. Those are not children from right now Gaza, although the situation is terrible, the humanitarian situation. And then you see, I don't know how many of my colleagues, friends repost all those pictures, all those photos. So if I would start answering back to every one of them and saying, check your sources, check where all those pictures are from, I'd still be here tomorrow. So it's hard. It's really hard. I do try and look out for dialogues. I talk to people, but I tend to not do it on social media because I don't think that's the right way. But yeah, there are lots of talks, and I try as much as I can to say, hey, listen, we need to check our sources. We need to be careful what it is that we post. But it's hard. It's really hard because you don't want to, end up being in a position where they say, oh, you can't report because you're biased. You're not reporting the way it's hard. It's really, really, really hard. And we've actually established a group after October 7th for all German Jewish journalists because we really needed some place safe to talk about exactly all these issues, and it's good because we have a safe space where we can talk about these things, and just to know that we're not alone because there are other German Jewish journalists who feel they don't know what to do because we've never been in a situation like this.
I'm still thinking about you saying that there are conversations among Jews in Germany about where do we go and the historical echo of that. So that's going over in my mind. But I'm interested to know from you whether, and this might have to be our last question, whether the emotions and feelings that you're describing, whether the community is going through those together in a unified way, or whether there are big arguments going on internally. We're doing this tour of round Jewish communities throughout August. I suspect we're going to hear in a lot of places internal argument that has been, particularly in the period since October 7th. What is the situation in Germany, as it were, internally in the Jewish community?
Obviously, I think there's no Jewish community in this world where you don't have internal arguments and fights. That's just the way it is. I mean, let's not, let's not sugarcoat it because that's just the way it is. And so
it's part of our charm.
It's part of the charm. It's just the way it is. So, okay, let's make that straight. And that is something, you try to see the positive side out of everything. At least that's the way I tend to see things. And that is something beautiful that I've seen, that you do feel very unified. And that's something that I think is part of, Nefesh Yehudi, the Jewish soul. That's what makes Jews Jews, and that's what makes us the way we are. Even in the biggest times of darkness, there's still this light that we see. And I feel very unified in that all over the world, Jews seem to be coming together and communities are coming together, because I think that's the secret why Israel is still there. Because in hard times and difficult times and times of wars, even if you have your differences, and I know there's no other country that likes to argue as much as Israelis and likes to portray their opinions. But if it comes down to things and in hard times, we stick together, we're unified. And that is something beautiful that I've been seeing in Germany throughout the communities at this very moment.
That is a beautiful place to end on. Ilanit Spinner, thank you, or Spinner. Thank you so much for talking to us. We really, really appreciate it. We've learned a lot.
Thank you for having me.
Fascinating to hear all of that from the perspective of Ilanit Spinner. We are grateful to her, and we will be spinning the globe and going somewhere else for our conversation next week. Ruth, as you know, because you've been with us before, we do like to hand out awards as to close out our episode. I think you might have a very good and strong nomination in the Chutzpah category.
Yeah, I think I do. Although I pronounce it Chutzpah, the Hebrew way. So it's hard for me to say the Chutzpah. But yeah, the Chutzpah award.
Don't get us started. There's a whole difference in meaning. We did a whole thing with Malcolm Gladwell.
You did?
About
Okay, I should listen to that.
Between the diaspora meaning of the word and the Israeli meaning of the word, and they mean different things. But
okay.
no, okay.
So my Chutzpah award goes to Yossi Sheli this week. Yossi Sheli is, for those who are unfamiliar, his titles sound very sort of impressive. He was the Israeli ambassador to Brazil. He was Israel's chief of staff to Netanyahu, and now he is Israel's ambassador to the UAE, to the Emirates. And this week it was announced that he would discontinue his post as ambassador and return to Israel because the Emiratis have been complaining that he has behaved in an undignified manner. He has been rude to his security detail service, apparently being sort of handsy with women in the Emirates. These are the rumors. It's sort of unclear what the dignified behavior is. But this is a man who is the very definition of sort of failing up. When he was in Brazil, I don't know if you remember, Jonathan, he tweeted a picture of him with Bolsonaro having lunch, and there was clearly lobster on their plates, and he did a very terrible job of photoshopping the lobsters out. And people called him out for it, and he said, no, it was salmon, it wasn't lobster. And then he had to quit his post as Brazil ambassador because, again, he made these sexual advances to a woman, or he denies it, but the accusation is that he made sexual advances towards a woman who went to the embassy for services, for help with a visa. And so he returned from Brazil, became Netanyahu's personal chief of staff, was apparently very well liked by Sarah Netanyahu because he also, as part of his job, he approved all of their home renovations and kind of extra budget expenditures. But finally, after October 7th, he had just a miserable run of media appearances in which he also said that, the Nova Music Festival, he said, quote, that it contributed to the chaos, right? Sort of presumably blaming music, the participants in this concert, over 300 of whom had been butchered to death by Hamas. On October 10th, he blames the music festival participants for contributing to the chaos. He leaves his job as chief of staff, is sent to the UAE, which is a very delicate and sensitive job for any Israeli, and now has to return with his tail between his legs. The very definition of chutzpah, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think so. I'm sure he would deny the specific charges that
all of it
confront him over his conduct, and indeed all of it. But the one thing he cannot deny is lobster is not kosher. Just in case some of our non-Jewish listeners didn't quite get the reference there, lobster is not kosher. He's not going to argue his way out of that one. No, I think a very worthy nominee. And by the way, a warning, just if you make loyalty to the boss the number one qualification for these sensitive jobs, this is the kind of thing that happens. We've seen it in other countries around the world as well. For Mensch, I've got a choice for Mensch, but I think you might have a nomination for the Mensch.
Okay, quickly.
Now, you also have a brilliant choice for our Mensch nominee. I want to do a mention in the same category to our missing co-host, Yoni Levy, who, along with a friend of the podcast, Biana Golodriga, has a new book out. Unbelievable, considering how she already has, I think, day jobs. But somehow the two of them together have written a book. I've had the privilege of reading it. It's great. It is aimed at younger readers, at teenagers. It's called Don't Feed the Lion. It's a children's book. It will be out later on in the autumn in the US and I think elsewhere. It dramatizes what has become a fact of life, so certainly for many Jews in North America. It is about a young bar mitzvah age soccer player, the Americans would say, I would say high school footballer or middle school footballer, who one day is on the receiving end of an anti-Semitic incident. I won't give any more detail than that. The book is called Don't Feed the Lion. I think it raises in a very new and arresting way an issue that I think probably really does need to be talked about. It's also just a cracking story. So I think people are going to love it. There is a link so you can pre-order it in today's episode description. So do make sure to do that. So mention for Yonit Levy and Biana Golodriga in the Mensch category for Don't Feed the Lion. But I know you have a choice of your own.
Mine is 99-year-old Mordechai Cohen, who made a trek to Hostages Square last Saturday. He is a Holocaust survivor himself, and he went there to meet with the hostage families. And there was a very moving encounter between him and Yael Adar, a hostage mother. Her son Tamir Adar was murdered on October 7th, and his body is being kept by Hamas. And there was an encounter there between this aging Holocaust survivor and the mother of a hostage, and he sort of, he starts crying, and she is the one who sort of strengthens him, and she says, we will fix it. And so the Mensch, he's the Mensch, she's the Mensch. It was just a very moving encounter to see.
Absolutely impossible to call between those two. The whole incident full of Menschlichkeit and Mensches in abundance in that scene that you describe very affectingly. I think we have done the traditional business with our awards, and we draw to a close this episode. Certainly an honourable mention, at the very least, to you, Ruth, for stepping in so brilliantly and taking on the task of co-hosting the podcast. Was hugely grateful to you, Ruth Margalit.
It was an absolute pleasure. Thank you, Jonathan.
And we will be back next week, including with our tour of Jewish communities around the world. And, of course, our thanks to Michal Porat for producing the podcast so expertly week after week. We will see you next time.